I was thinking about something interesting today about morality, ethics, because that's really what it all boils down to. Which group keeps more laws and which group keeps less laws? And that's really how the world should be separated. And when I speak of laws, I mean laws in Torah, laws that work, laws that make this world a better place. From a halachic perspective, then when we're trying to think from a halachic perspective, we always have to make distinctions. And I think the biggest distinction anyone could ever make is between what literally appears in Torah and what was introduced by Chazal, the Sanhedrin, the sages, the judges, rabbis, etc. So, at least from a Torah perspective, I think it's pretty safe to say that better a Christian than a Noahide. And for sure, better a Messianic Jew, a Torah-keeping Messianic Jew, than a Noahide. Because if you really think about it, the movements are quite identical. Now, one could say that a Christian fails because of the prohibition we find within the Noahide laws that prohibits idolatry. I know that colloquially nowadays is understood that Christianity is a form of idolatry. So let's put that aside for a second. We'll get back to it. From a Torah perspective, you do know that the Torah literally does not prohibit idolatry on Gentiles. It prohibits it from those who entered the covenant, absolutely. But it doesn't prohibit idolatry to Gentiles, at least literally, in terms of what appears in the 5 books of Moses, right? And that's really how we have to approach this when we're dealing with people of the world, people who are not Jewish, who are not in the covenant, who don't study Torah, especially when we're asking the question, who does more good? So, from a Torah perspective, it seems that both Noahidism and Christianity are in a similar boat. How? Because you have two belief systems that pick and choose what they want to keep and discard from our God's Torah. Now, the average Christian, they feel that every ethical command that appears in Torah, one has to keep. And only those that are ceremonial are the ones to be disposed of. While a Noahide will not separate it between ethical and ceremonial, but will just literally pick and choose. If he's not just going to stick to the 7 laws, especially with this new Neo-Ger movement, this movement of the Ger Toshav, or Gerim Toshavim, they will literally just pick and choose what they want to keep. Because yes, but many of them take upon more commandments than happen to exist in the 7 Noahide prohibitions, or the 6th prohibition and the 1 law to establish courts, the 1 positive commandment within the 7 Noahide laws. So from that perspective, you have 2 belief systems that claim to have their roots in Torah, that both pick and choose what their practitioners have to keep and not keep. So how are they really different? Easy. Whichever group feels bound to keep more ethical commands is better, and the one who feels no obligation to keep any more than 7 laws, but is allowed to sort of pick and choose whatever laws make sense to him enough to keep, should be deemed worse. And this is why the Noahide movement was crippled from the outset. That apart from not having an actual place in this world, in terms of where are they going to pray, who are their kids going to marry, having no structure, failing to act as a viable alternative to the religion it replaced, i.e. Christianity or perhaps Islam, it seems that it would benefit not just the practitioner, but the world if every Noahide reverted back to Christianity or perhaps Islam. Now one could say, how about the prohibition of idolatry? The prohibition of idolatry exists within what's called the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 laws of the children of Noah. However, this code of 7 laws are rabbinic. In other words, nowhere in Torah does God make a distinction between his laws. The same God who said, don't eat pork, is the same God who said, don't mix wool and linen, or don't eat the limb of a living animal. So being that the Torah doesn't prohibit the Gentile from practicing idolatry, that could just be another law that the Christian chooses not to adhere to. In other words, if we're already in the business of picking and choosing what we're going to keep and what we're not going to keep, why would it hinder the Christian to choose not to remain a monotheist? And I acknowledge the average Christian does not deny that he's a monotheist. But at least to make this talk a little more relatable to those in the modern Jewish world who are used to pointing their finger at Christians and calling them idolaters. Now clearly the standard is to keep all of Torah, and God willing, love Torah and God to such an extent that he or she would want to run to Judaism, run to go through a formal conversion process. But that's not the topic of this talk. The topic of this talk is, does it benefit the world and Gentiles to either remain Christian or become Noahides? And this is really the downside of choosing and picking what you're going to follow and what you're not going to follow. Because like I said before, what if the Christian chooses to toss out the monotheistic idea of Judaism, just like a Noahide or a Ger Toshav will choose to discard other commands, which were uttered by the same God who make no distinction in these commands? Are you getting my drift here? Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, well, we know that the pious of the nations, if they keep the 7 laws because they came through Moses or through the Jewish legal system, they get a place in the world to come. But that itself is a medrash. That itself is what's called a gadata, folklore and legend. It's not a fact. Even the Rambam himself contradicts himself. Right? He says one thing in Hilchos Malachim and he says something else in Surabia. In Surabia he says that they don't get a chelik olam haba. And in Hilchos Malachim he says they do. Why? Because Chazal themselves were split on the issue. In other words, it's not a law. It's just an opinion. And there's many other rabbis who disagreed. Long story short, Noahides have built their existence on folklore and legend because halakha only applies to Jews. And that's the only thing that's absolute and binding outside of what appears in Torah Shebiktav. And in terms of structure, in terms of what makes a better Gentile, a more ethical Gentile, I would say everything points to that Gentile remaining Christian or even possibly becoming a Messianic Jew, then entering a system that has no structure, where the practitioners get to choose what ethical commands and even ceremonial commands they want to keep. Now, the average Christian has a monolithic understanding on how ethics actually works. Like I said earlier, the Christian believes that every ethical edict uttered by God through Moses must be kept, and only lumps the ceremonial into what they call works. While Messianic Jews, or Christians of a Hebrew persuasion, try to keep all the law. How is that not better if keeping more of God's commandments makes you a greater servant of God? That's how you serve God, by keeping his laws. So how can we say that a group that keeps more of his laws are in some way worse than a group that keeps less of his laws? Because the truth of the matter is, in reality, in terms of halakha, the 7 laws do not exist outside of the land of Israel. Now, just knowing that should act as a rude awakening for any Noahide in America thinking that God in some way expected him not just to keep the Noahide laws, but to consider them as a viable option or alternative to full conversion to Judaism. But I'm sure your rabbi told you, no, the 7 laws are for every nation. It's actually not true. Yes, it's for every Gentile living within the land of Israel, which is why the halakha is that one is only allowed to make a ger toshav when the Jews are back in Israel and the Jubilee is being kept. And outside of that, the Rambam says it's clear that their only option is to convert to Judaism. So Jews should ask themselves, what actually does good instead of what feels good? And what does good is encouraging Gentiles to become full converts to Judaism, instead of peddling a system that has been hijacked in the last 30 years only to keep Gentiles from converting to Judaism. So what's my advice to you? My advice to every Gentile listening is to pursue all of Torah, to worship the God of Israel properly. And the only way you worship the God of Israel properly is by keeping all his commandments, all of them. Commandments that encourage you to enter a covenant with God, carry the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision, and establish Israel. And not just establish Israel, but enter it. For more information about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.